welcome once again dear friends. This is I think becoming more interesting because we are going deeper to the understanding of international trade, especially the strategies which are derived from the theory. And in the theory we largely focus on strategies of the neoclassical framework, and where we derived endowment as the factor behind trade. Which kind of endowment, what quality of endowment, what prices of the endowment, these are very important aspects of international trade. Now, HO theory has already been understood, which largely talks about differential endowment, specializes their product, and the trade takes place between countries. But Samuelson added to the distribution of income and the flow of income to other countries, and so accordingly the original theory gets multiplied with value, and so therefore the 14th lecture of this this is the 14th lecture which emphasizes further empirical testing of HO Heckscher-Ohlin theory to make ourselves confirmed whether HO theory is actually applied in reality or not. So, there are many examples, but we will try largely for Indian context as compared to others, to what extent HO theory is valid for India. Now, in this lecture we are emphasizing or we are explaining empirical testing of Heckscher-Ohlin model. This is lecture number 14, and myself Dr. Pratap C. Mohanty, faculty member of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Roorkee. Where we left in the last lecture, it is on a complete mapping of our discussion. The complete discussion of HO theory is presented here. Now, first you stick to the circle, the center circle, where it's on Heckscher-Ohlin theory of international trade. There are some assumptions we discussed, largely the assumption broadly on factory intensity and abundance, and also same technology, constant international scale, perfect competition, two combinations, two commodities and two factors world, incomplete specialization, full employment, perfect mobility of factors. Those are the assumptions we have already clarified in our previous lectures, and we also emphasized to the fact that Heckscher-Ohlin theory never negated the comparative cost advantage, rather they explain the comparative advantage in a larger context. So, explain comparative advantage rather than assuming it, and the prediction from the model is like this. It helps us explaining international trade in the modern world, where the endowment decides their exchange of goods and services. So, exports are made based on the specialization which is derived through the endowment that each country possessed with. Other aspects of HO theory as HOS, Samuelson, where we started discussing about equalization, factor price equalization theorem, and which states that the wage rate of one country, wage rate of country 1 should be equalized with the wage rate of country 2 after trade. Similarly, the rent of one country should be equalized with country 2. And whereas another addition to the HOS theory is by Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which says that it is not just wage, across the sectors and their remuneration are also equalized. Wage is equalized with rent, and wage rate in another industry are also equalized with rent in another industry. So, basically it is not just price of factors, price of products are equalized, not just price of one factor is equalized the price of another in another country, it is also equalized all across the factors. Largely they believe to the fact that, or they tested to the fact that this will follow a one price model, one price framework, either it may be product, may be factor. But there are lack of evidences for HOS model, especially for this one price framework. We will try to verify from some of our examples. Let us go for it. A case we wish to present it for our better understanding between the trade of US and India. Now, if we read between the lines, trade opening of cases, opening of causes prices of machines and prices of cloth to equalize between countries. This is what let us assume to the fact that we are referring to cloth and referring to machines. Machines we largely emphasize from the product from US and cloth from India, and cloth we are assuming to be more labor intensive. Size of machine and cloth industries will change of each country and changing their industrial structure because of trade. Now, let us further assume in these two sector the US has comparative advantage in machine, which I have said. So, and it is capital intensive as per the HO framework. So, this causes an increased demand for machines because of their specialization, and that will help in reducing the prices of machines. The price of machines rises relatively to that of price of cloth because there are over demand for machines. So, relative prices of machines will rise, and that price will rises as compared to the cloth. So, machine production expands, cloth production contracts, especially in US, because we are referring now to US case. Increased demand for inputs also, those who are engaged for the production of machines are now being demanded. So, those factors are actually demanded. So, factor prices are expected to be higher. So, increase in capital greater than that of increase in labor, as machines are capital intensive, especially in US. So, resources shifted from cloth to machines in US, and the cloth industry declines because of the fact that they are specializing more on machines. So, imports therefore, they largely emphasize on machines, and they export it, and in return they import cloth. So, imports replace much domestic production. Since they import from US, import cloth from India to US. So, now US domestic production cloth actually reduce. This is what it replaced domestic production. So, more labor than capital release on market. Now, who are more released? Because they are not engaging labor. Here we are assuming cloth to be more labor intensive. So, since they are not producing labor, they are not producing cloth. So, laborers are not demanded too much. So, they release more laborer from that cloth industry. And so, therefore, but they demand more capital. So, capital shortage increases profit. So, return goes to those sectors which engage more capital. So, there are surplus of labor in US. So, surplus of labor leads to fall in the wages in US. So, in one case wage rate falls in US, whereas this comparatively increases in US. Now, let us move to check India case. Similarly, India case can be explained. Now, India has comparative advantage in cloth, as we already assumed. So, therefore, there is increased demand for cloth over the time, because more demand are coming from US, and the prices of cloth will relatively rise as compared to machine. So, machine production contracts in India. So, cloth production expands. So, demand for factors which are engaged in cloth, especially wage rate increases in US in India, wage rate increases and relatively rent falls. This is just the reverse. If you just check it previously, here we said this, and here we said just the reverse. Now, based on this, W is actually rising in one country, simultaneously it is falling in another country, and for rent accordingly arguments are followed. So, increase in labor greater than the increase in the capital, as cloth is labor intensive in India. So, resources shift from machines to cloth in India, machines industry declines in India. So, we have already discussed these things in our previous slide. The same argument as followed. Now, what is the bottom line then? The bottom line of discussion here, wages decline in US because they are not demanding cloth to be produced, they are importing it, whereas just the contrast in India it increases. So, look at profits earned by the capitalist, by the the sectors which engage capital, then profits increase in US and decrease in India. Okay, here decline, here increase, here increase, and here it is decline, or in reverse, if, I mean we can explain convergence of prices. So, overall factor prices get closure, that means whatever the factor prices they have in one country as compared to other, this gets closure. So, there are possibility of equalization. So, just as we find in the goods prices. Now, let us wrap up by saying the HO theory with certain historical context. A 1951 test of the HO theory. Now, we are actually counting down some of the empirical testing of HO, and simultaneously based on the testing we will talk about certain paradoxes, certain criticism to the Leontief paradox or to the HO theory in terms of Leontief paradox. Leontief is actually a statistician, economic statistician who tested HO theory in 1951 using US data for the year 1947 with the help of an input output table, IO table. In the IO table, US actually based on the US data, Leontief identified many facts, and those facts are actually contradicting to the HO model, and they showed that the pattern of trade did not fit the conclusion of HO theorem. As per the HO theorem, US must export capital intensive product, India must export labor intensive product, or the countries which are endowed with certain varieties of factor will specialize and export to another country, and in return will import another variety which are scarce in their country. But in their calculation of Leontief model, or in Leontief calculation using the US data of 1947, the result came in 1951. They find that, or they observed that exports in US seem to be more labor intensive. So, rather US actually exports more labor intensive product, and they should have been, but actually they should have been capital intensive, which is contrasting to the HO theorem. And so, they assumed a two factor world which required assumption about what is capital and what is labor. What is the source of this paradox, and why we are saying it is a paradox? Because it is against, it seems as if US should actually export capital intensive product, but actually they are exporting labor intensive product. It is a clear paradox, and this is the strongest criticism to the HO theory. And and what is the source of this bias? Since they assume that two factor world with the assumption that assume a two factor world which required assumption about what is capital and what is labor, and there are assumption of capital intensiveness and labor intensiveness for two countries. So, there is no such variation in their model. Most heavily protected industries in US were labor intensive. Protected industries are actually labor intensive as derived by Leontief. Reduce imports, since they are labor intensive, they do not depend on other countries, so that reduce imports, and increase domestic production of labor intensive. So, especially in the protective industries, these cases are not valid. So, only human capital included as capital. So, the assumptions are very limited. Only physical capital are considered to be the capital, but it is not physical capital that matters, it is the human capital. So, like education, jobs, training, skills, knowledge, these are various aspects to define capital in detail, but just physical capital may not be completing, therefore, paradoxes are derived. So, these are emphasized by these economists, who says that paradox is derived. So, HO theory cannot be just universally applied, so cannot be defined as a law. Now, more clearly, more evidences are also derived by other economists, especially in Krugman's work, Krugman and Ostfeld work. We have seen that with the examples of Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Caribbeans, South Asia, here these are written. South Asia, 1 stands for Sub-Saharan Africa, 2 stands for Latin America and Caribbeans, 3 stands for South Asia, and 4 stands for East Asia and the Pacific. 4 here stands for East Asia and Pacific, and 5 stands for industrial market economies. This is 5, and 1 stands for Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, on the horizontal axis, this is an arrow, both side arrow, where we are saying abundant labor and scarce skilled workers. Here we are saying scarce land and abundant skilled workers. So, abundant land, in the first here we say abundant land, this side less, I mean land, and this side it is, I mean this side is more land, this country is poised with more land and less labor, more land and less labor. This side we are emphasizing land less as compared to labor. So, the countries are actually mapped accordingly. Now, on the vertical axis, so we are explaining, we are trying to find out what contribution in which type of production they produce based on these endowments in different countries. Now, here they are saying manufacturing exports, here it is primary exports, maybe agricultural varieties related produce exports. Now, based on this mapping, a comparative advantage with skills and land is made, where it has been observed that the low countries, the countries like Sub-Saharan Africa here, Sub-Saharan Africa is more poised with land as compared to labor, skilled labor, and they are primarily exporting what? Primarily exporting primary or very basic goods. Whereas, if you look at industrialized countries 5, they are more abundant with skilled labor, this is not labor, skilled labor. So, more abundant with skilled labor, but the land is scarce like European countries, OECD countries. So, they export more of manufacturing goods. So, skilled, but labor are more engaged in manufacturing goods. So, what they export? Manufacturing goods to other countries. And so what kind of comparative advantage are actually followed based on this, and it is a clear mapping. So, there is a upward sloping when we have countries with more skilled labor, they are more engaged in manufacturing goods. So, now the bottom line of this slide or this diagram suggests that capital just cannot be defined by physical abundance of capital, rather it can be defined as skilled labor as well. Skilled labor would be more engaged in the manufacturing production, and accordingly exports are defined. So, HO theory is very limited in that sense. Now, what else? What are the other criticisms of HO theory, empirical evidences which are made? One of the finest article by Indian economist Minans in 1962 on the basis of elasticity of substitution, I think it is mentioned here, of the factors engaged in different sectors. Now, factors which are engaged in different sectors, to what extent they are elastic, and the nature of changes based on the productivity or the based on remuneration, to what extent they actually change. What is the marginal changes of factors being engaged in different sectors. Now, this elasticity of substitutions, the percentage change of substitution with respect to the given engagement in the sectors identified by Minans, he emphasized and defined a very different result as compared to the fact mentioned in HO theorem. They contradict the HO theorem. They said that labor, a product which is defined to be labor intensive in one country, simultaneously that is capital intensive in another country. But in HO theory, we said that one product by stricter assumption should be labor intensive in one country and another product to be capital intensive in another country. So, now this says a given commodity is labor intensive in the labor abundant nation and the same commodity is capital intensive in capital abundant nation. So, they observe that the product not just cannot be defined, cannot be just defined as labor intensive in one country, the same product can be capital intensive, but in the assumption that the same product should be labor intensive in both the countries, which is not validated. Says that the factors choose their best options in their engagement, and then the skilling part as we just discussed are also responsible for their switching over effect. So, the concept of elasticity of substitution is useful to measure this, and this is called factor intensity reversal. The intensity of the factors are actually reversed. The intensity not necessarily confined to in a very rigid framework, the factor can be intensively used in another industry. So, therefore, a commodity is labor intensive in one country, the same commodity can be capital intensive in another country, which is contradicting to the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So, FIR, that is factor intensity reversal, is neither present in HO model nor also factor equalization model by HOS, or also neither in the Stolper-Samuelson model. So, in all FIR contradicts all models so far discussed. Actually, it is quite obvious the commodity cannot just be intensive in all the countries. Labor, as I just said, manufacturing in the high income rising or the high income countries are engaging skilled labor in their manufacturing sector, and they produce using the skilled labor, and they are the next exporter of those varieties, and that is due to skilled labor, not just due to machines. So, the very definition of defining labor or the capital is erroneous in the HO model. So, the first empirical study, as I just said, was made based on this intensity reversal and was found prevalent. So, later on also again re-emphasized by Leontief, Ball in 1964 and also 1966 respectively. So, the FIR factor intensity reversal is clearly a objection to the HO model, clearly a contradiction to the HO model, because the proposition is not valid. So, it is also contradict other two model, HOS model, factor price equalization, it is not necessarily going to equalize the prices as mentioned in this one. So, what are the qualifications for reversal? We wanted to say implicitly we have assumed that if a good is actually capital intensive relative to good Y, at one price ratio it will be capital intensive on all prices. So, FIR when it, FIR is when a good is relatively capital intensive at one set of factor prices, but relatively capital intensive at another. So, the same good which I just said is actually in one case it is capital intensive, in another country or another case it is also labor intensive. So, therefore, the intensity reversal. So, other interpretation of FIR are the following. FIR occurs when capital labor can be substituted, and that will be measured through ES, elasticity of substitution, and then those substituted more easily in production of one good than another. For example, suppose apple production is more flexible, similarly even cloth also, if it is more flexible, then people or the manufacturer will utilize the available resources accordingly, and if those some of the prices are getting cheaper, so they will also reverse the factor engagement, and that will lead to some kind of further adjustment. So, factor intensity reversal not necessarily I mean is necessarily contradicting the existing model because of this change. Now, if W by R is high, Apple, I mean basically if wage rate is higher, Apple producer will choose relatively capital intensive method as compared to botane is one of the organic product, if it is using more of capital intensive one. If WS starts fall, then Apple producers will actually substitute. Now, one interesting result of this model which says that if prices are changing, then there are lots of expectations of also using those factors interchangeably. So, expectations will actually again dilute the very postulations of HO model. So, eventually what we wanted to say is the following: it is possible that apples might be produced in a relatively labor intensive manner as compared to botany. So, suppose France is another example, we can go for it. France is capital and abundant relative to Germany. So, accordingly the ratio of uses are made. And so, we have already discussed this, how intensiveness is defined, and the factor intensities reversal are discussed. If trade begins according to HO theorem that the relative capital abundant country will export relatively capital intensive good, and relatively abundant country will export relatively labor intensive good, which is actually contradicted with the examples of apples which I just said. So, therefore, Heckscher-Ohlin theory does not work when FIR are present. And what are the bottom line then? If FIR present, HO theorem breaks down, and if FIR are common, we would better find another theory which will complete the HOS model. In our next week, we will be discussing in detail about many aspects of other problems as an advanced version of HO theory by including many other factors. So, in the real world we have neglected the cost of transport in the international trade framework. So, how to actually incorporate it? If you are including transport case, then how the model gets changed should be emphasized. Let us take the case of supply and demand aspects of Mexico and US, especially in textile sector. This is the basic framework in a diagram. Now, this is look at US, this is Mexico. I hope it is visible, and where we just try to look at a partial equilibrium setup. This is purely a partial equilibrium, we are only sticking to textile demand and textile demand in both the countries. This is textile supply and textile supply in both the countries. Now, based on the domestic availability of resources or the endowments, the country primarily setting an equilibrium price. Now, in Mexico, so far as textile is concerned, we have already discussed the prices is here, their domestic price is here, especially in the autarky situation, the prices is here, Mexico's maximum price, whereas as compared to US, the prices are set as here as the autarky price. Because of trade, now based on this situation, we can infer one thing, Mexico is specializing in the production of textile, because Mexico is a labor intensive country, especially in textile sector, and so there will be trade possible, and prices of this one will fall and price will rise, and they will reach to a level that will equalize price, and that price is called international prices, and where the import demand by US are perfectly matched by the export supply by Mexico. This vertical distance, this horizontal distance must be equalized in order to have an international price to be defined, and that will be sustainably defined, and it will be continued as an international equilibrium price. Now, once we chip in the transportation cost to this model, the situation will be a bit different. Now, suppose Mexico tries to pass along 100% of the transportation cost to US consumers, because they are exporting, and what will happen? So, in this case US textile price will rise and quantity of imports demanded will fall. So, they will price will relatively rise and fall. Mexico will have a surplus because they will get higher return even, and will eventually, I mean, because those products are not sold. So, their products are not getting purchased by US. Eventually, they will reduce the price level and the price level will be maintained at a certain point. Now, therefore, unless Mexico is the only seller in world, transportation cost will be borne by both the consumers, not just US, also the sellers, because if just borne by US, then prices will fall and it will be in the long run problematic for Mexico to supply their products. There will be less demand. So, the graph will change accordingly. Now, international prices may go off. Now, I mean, initially we say that adding in transportation cost, if it is borne by this, so prices will actually rise. So, that will look at this, whereas prices will now, since transportation costs are less, prices will fall. Now, less products are actually demanded. So, if less products are demanded, so less products will be supplied by Mexico to US. So, it will be forcing down for Mexico to reduce their price further. So, in the international level price will fall and the price will be maintained. So, therefore, adding transportation cost is not making such a bigger obstacle if it is borne by both the countries. This is what we discussed. In the bottom line, HO theorem will still hold because price is still going to be equalizing. The factor price equalization theorem breaks down because factor prices only equalize if the commodity prices do, but if commodity prices are different, factor prices are not going to be equalized. So, therefore, there will be some problems. So, relaxing what other suggestions are made, it is not just the Heckscher-Ohlin theory with the assumption to make large in a HO model to be in a larger context, we are supposed to relax many other assumptions which I have already discussed, and these are insert mentioned. Other assumptions are actually relaxed in our advanced model in the modern or new classical models, which will take it forward in other classes. With this, I think we have understood the concept very clearly, and we will take it forward other models in our next successive classes. Thank you so much.